today's iBiology Hangout, and we're going to have a conversation of two Rons here. So let me introduce one Ron, which is myself. I'm Ron Vale from UCSF, and also founder of iBiology. And today I have the great pleasure to be talking to Ronald Germain at the NIH. He's the chief of lymphocyte biology section and the Laboratory of Systems Biology at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease at the NIH. Ron is a very accomplished scientist. He's a member of the National Academy of Medicine. He was trained at Brown University and then got his MD PhD at Harvard Medical School. And he's been a real leader in understanding T-cell function, and he's really done fantastic scientific work that really operates in multiple scales. At one level, he's done amazing imaging of T-cell function in their native environment, in lymphoid organs and other organs, to really understand how T-cells are interacting and interrogating antigen-presenting cells. And at another level, he thinks very mechanistically at the level of how these signaling molecules work, including really modeling the whole system of how T-cells become activated. But today we're going to talk about another subject, and I think Ron is one of these exceptional individuals who's not only a gifted scientist, but he's also someone I think that's deeply committed, well, is deeply committed to the scientific enterprise, has invested a lot of his own thought and effort in how to improve the scientific enterprise, particularly for young scientists. And that is going to be the subject of today's lecture. Not lecture, but discussion. So the purpose of this is really to have an interactive session where I might ask some questions, but we definitely want the audience to ask questions as well. So you there as viewers should be thinking in the back of your mind about questions that you'd like to ask Ron. Now, Ron has published a very interesting and influential piece in Cell recently. That article describes his ideas for a new strategy of NIH supporting young scientists. And I would suspect that's going to be the main subject of today's discussion. He's also given an iBiology talk on his ideas, and if you haven't seen that, I would certainly recommend that you look at that as well. But I think we'll kick off this iBiology Hangout by giving Ron a few minutes, also say hello, and to introduce his thoughts on how NIH should support young scientists, and then we'll go to some questions. So Ron, I'll pass the mic over to you, and thank you very much for joining us.
Well, you're welcome. I feel like I have to thank the organizers for the invitation to speak at this August event, and thank you for that very kind introduction. Let me go and, in a way, paraphrase what's in the iBiology video, which I think helps understand what's in the Cell commentary, and also why I came to this. So I've been supported by the Intramural Program at NIH for more than 30 years, and that's a very unique system. I write very little on an annual basis to get my budget and funding. I get reviewed by external people, external review panels every 4 years to see what I've done. And it's primarily a retrospective review. And I've had pretty stable funding, except for the last few years, suffering the same sequestration as everybody else. And that's enabled me to pretty much pick and choose what I want to do, when I want to change what I'm doing. And I've moved from a cellular immunologist to a molecular immunologist to a cell biologist to an imager where it would have been virtually impossible to support that type of work through the traditional grant system. And I'm pretty grateful to NIH and always appreciated that investment in me as a scientist and this kind of retrospective review. I also was on the Howard Hughes review panel for a while, which is primarily, again, a retrospective review of people who are empowered to do the best and most creative science they can do. And I know other approaches that are similar to that. And that conflated with my listening to my many extramural colleagues tell me about the vagaries and the problems with the current R01 grant system. And then this was really all brought to a head by the experience of my son at Stanford, where many of his classmates who were in labs doing research, even publishing papers as undergraduates, said there really was no career for them to stay in or go into science as a profession. And all of that spoke to me to say that somehow we're discouraging people from doing what they really would like to do, and we're not giving people the best opportunity to do the most creative work. Everybody was talking about all the preliminary data they need in each of the grants. And so the commentary and what I talked about in the iBiology video is to take a page from the NIH Intramural Program, Hughes, Wellcome, a few other places, and really switch much more to a support the individual than to support the individual project or grant. Now, there are lots of details in the write-up about how to actually enable that to happen, and we can come back to that in maybe some questions. But one of the primary concerns that comes up is that wouldn't this put young people in competition with more established investigators, and wouldn't they always lose? And so I want to emphasize that the way that I've put this proposal forward, it directly empowers young individuals when they get their first job to get funding, not in competition with any more senior individuals. And then as they're retrospectively reviewed, that review is based on what they have accomplished and not in comparison to larger, more established laboratories that are accomplishing what they accomplished. And so it really is geared to try to give everybody at all stages of their career the best footing to do the most freedom, to do the most creative, most interesting science they can do. And I think relieving people of this, you need 50% of your data in hand and specific aims already done, and it can't be very risky, is not the best way for us to move forward as efficiently as possible. So we can now flesh out details, or you can ask questions, and people can write in questions to try to go to some of the practicalities of accomplishing that.
Well, maybe just before we go on, just to get everyone on the same page, maybe you could describe very briefly, including for maybe a new graduate student that's watching this, how the current R01 system works. If you're a junior investigator, you just got a job at University X, and you're applying to the NIH for funding, how does that system work now, and how would you like to see it changed?
Okay. Well, right now, you have to submit what's called a grant proposal. They have become very formulaic. You really get dinged and you lose points during the review process if you don't state a very explicit hypothesis, which has implications if you're trying to do work that generates hypotheses, but we can come back to that. But you state your hypothesis, and then you have to state the specific aims you have to work through either validating or invalidating that hypothesis. In each of those aims, you have to specify what could go wrong. So you need to somehow know that in advance. And then what you would do to fix each thing if you were stymied in accomplishing each of those aims. And most importantly, you have to provide enough preliminary data to convince the people reading your grant that you'll be successful, which more or less, according to my colleagues, since I don't write these, I have to go by what I've been told, is somewhere in the order of nowadays 50% of your specific aims need to have enough data to really show they've actually been accomplished before someone will take the risk to give you money in that grant. You then get a score. It may or may not be fundable, assuming you're not triaged out of the system entirely. And right now we're at somewhere on the order of 8 to 10%. So only 1 out of any 10 grants in any round of review is going to get funded. So very tough haul. It's about as difficult as getting into the most selected institutions at any level of admission you're talking about. But here, it's not like you just get into another institution. Here, you don't get your money if you don't get it. What I'm proposing is that when you are applying for your first faculty job, when and if, presumably when, you get that job, you get adequate funding for a modest but reasonably sized laboratory to run for somewhere between 5 to 7 years. And you don't have to specify in great detail, other than to the hiring institution and whatever standards they have, what you really plan to do. Surely not magnesium concentrations and buffers the way you sometimes have to do in a grant now. And at the end of that period, you're reviewed for what did you accomplish. And continued funding hinges on you having made a significant contribution to the field. And there's some up and down grades beyond that, but that's more or less how the system works. And what's nice about this is it's always rolling retrospective review, so there's no issue of whether you're a senior person and you've accumulated all this money or not. Each round looks at what you've accomplished in the recent past and tracks how you're performing. And so this really frees up young people to do something that's different than what they did in their postdoc, because they don't need that preliminary data to justify the grant. It takes away the requirement to go sit in an office and not actually still be in the lab when you're the most potentially productive person in your group. And it gives you an assurance before you've gotten this job, while you're considering going into science, that provided you have the ego structure to feel that you are accomplished enough to compete for a position at an academic institution, that you're going to have the chance to show your ability to conduct really good science. And I think that's really liberating, and it's what I said was the case here at NIH for very junior Hughes people and so forth.
And there's maybe, and then we'll go on to other questions, there's one other, I think, important part of your proposal that I think would be good to get out to the viewers that you could explain, in that the way the current system works is you get a job at a university and then you try. It may take you 5 years to get an NIH grant. But in your proposal, you're coupling the job with NIH support. So I think that's another important difference. So maybe can you just explain that a little bit as well?
Right. I think this has always been the problem. Yes, you get a startup package in almost all places that recruit research scientists now, but that, if you're lucky, lasts 2 years perhaps. And even during that period, most institutions, again, from what I'm told by my colleagues, are already pushing for people to begin to put in R01 applications. And success for the R01 funding is as or more important for consideration for promotion to associate professor or for tenure later on. And so everything's hinging on getting this R01 grant, and many people I know basically retreat to an office to go and do that rather than actually being really actively involved in the laboratory work. Here, the proposal is that there are allocated funds. My own suggestion is they go to the institution, so they're there already, but other people have suggested individuals could apply to NIH and have this kind of portable money that goes with them, and we can come back to why I feel more strongly that it works as an institutional award. But when you get the job, you have the money to do what you need to do with a reasonable sized group for a period of time, and there's no sort of Damocles hanging over your head. Are you going to get this R01? How big is my lab going to be? Can I hire somebody? What am I going to run out of my startup money? And all the angst that comes from the current system.
Okay, that's great. Well, let me take a first question here. I think to some extent we could also frame the discussion about really, at the beginning, really discussing some of the current problems with the system that kind of led you to think about the fact that we need potentially changes in the way we're doing our business. And maybe later on we can drill down on some of the specifics of your proposal. But let me, the first question is from Shannon. What issues do you identify as being the most negatively impactful to the biomedical research enterprise? And how is the R01 grant system linked to some of these issues?
Well, I think that we've covered a little bit of it, but there is this enormous disincentive to people who say, I'm not going to really be judged on what I can accomplish. I'm going to be judged by this small package of paper that goes to people where there are questions about whether the review panels as they're currently constituted are really the best for judging things, where if I'm very creative, I'm going to actually have things count against me because it's not predictably positive in the outcome from the exploration. And that's all a very high level of disincentive for many people to decide to go and do this. The second thing is, even for those people with the fire in the belly where it doesn't matter, they're going to do science anyway. And many people have said that's always going to happen. Why do you worry about the people who are being dissuaded? But even for those people, they're basically being told constantly in the current process to do the predictable, the small, the incremental, which can be judged by others as likely to succeed, where success just means you get some more data, as opposed to take the stab at something that's risky, not always the most obvious thing to do, but could be enormously impactful in terms of what is found. It's sort of not how things are supported. And then a third part of this is simply time management. It used to be, when I first came into the field, and I actually had an R01 when I was at Harvard, that if you spent over the course of a year 10 or 15% of your time working on your grant or grants, that was probably a lot. And so it helped you think about your work. It was valuable, but it didn't consume you in terms of you were mostly doing your science. Now, most people are saying that they spend 50% of their time working on grants, and most of it's rewriting or recasting things they've already written. So it's not new thinking, it's not new data interpretation, it's just paper shuffling. And so these are all very negative parts. They discourage entry into the field, they discourage creative science, they discourage spending time on the creative aspects of the science, and all of that comes from the current structure of our R01 system.
Okay, I'm going to we have a couple questions that either were tweeted or emailed to us, but I think both of these questions really come to the core of some key issues that I think a lot of young people, young scientists are interested in. So here's one of them, which is something that will be very interesting to hear your opinions on. The question is, many feel that there are too many trainees in the system right now and not enough faculty positions to go around. Can switching to this mechanism address the issue around the size of the biomedical workforce?
So the proposal was aimed primarily at R01. It mentions very briefly, because it just couldn't cover everything, issues that relate to training. And this is really a critical part. One of the arguments I made in the commentary is that if you just do the math, we have a population disequilibrium. There are too many people coming in for the number of dollars that are, or that anybody in a reasonable way would predict will become available for doing the work. And so we have to do a kind of a balance here. And the only way for that really to happen is to either get rid of an awful lot of people already in the system, and it's not clear that that number even works, or one has to begin to titrate the entry of folks into the systems. There was enormous expansion of graduate programs without really thought to whether they really would be appropriate jobs. And we could talk about alternative careers, but for the numbers we're talking about, it doesn't work especially well unless there are going to be an awful lot of PhD high school teachers in the country. because the pharma is not hiring, they're actually firing. There are not that many new journals that people really want to work at. You're not going to the patent office, and so forth. And so there's going to have to be an equilibration, and there's going to be a period in which those numbers don't completely add up. There's no magic way for that to change. But I want to emphasize that the way the proposal is cast, over time, labs will come to a different equilibrium where there will not be this demand for mere hands, which in part drives the recruitment into the graduate programs, but rather a nice mix of more permanent staff and a focus on a slightly smaller number of trainees who get more training because they're not just put into a group where they are, fodder for turning things over. And I think that will help approach an equilibrium that really works.
And if I could just drill down on that individual's question a little bit more. Currently the system is a little more Darwinian in the sense that you can get a faculty position, and then whether you get NIH funding along with that is uncertain. In your proposal, the job would come effectively with funding in most cases. So there would be some kind of, I'm just curious about your opinion on the filter that would go in terms of postdocs getting their first jobs, whether that will be a more stringent filter in the pipeline from the onset.
It will, because it will be trading off this notion of having many people come in, but a certain fraction always failing, with more selective choice of those individuals because of the change in the magnitude of the equivalent of the startup funding is now this whole package, and there's only a certain envelope of funding for the whole system. Now, none of us are perfect in choosing who will be the most successful people, so there has to be some play in the system here. But as far as Darwinian selection is concerned, I think the problem is what's being selected for. Selection can operate on many different qualities. Right now, there are a number of people who feel that the selection is for how willing are you to write 20 grants a year, and not how good are you in doing creative science in your lab. And often there's almost an inverse sometimes between those particular skill sets, that people who really are dedicated to being in the lab and doing science chafe at having to constantly write proposals for people who are looking for whether they get the magnesium concentration wrong or didn't have that last figure 5F for preliminary data. And so they actually may fail in a system where, if they were supported, their work might be more interesting than those who keep writing these and, given the stochastic nature of 10% funding, eventually get money. So I'm not sure we wind up in a worse place in terms of any filter by trying to pre-select the people based on their job, their hiring, and giving them funding.
Okay, well, I think that is a perfect transition in terms of talking about selection and how and who will succeed in this system. There's a question from Gary McDowell, and Gary's question is, in this proposal, doesn't focusing on the person rather than the science run the risk of favoring people from prestigious institutions, thus accelerating the reliance on arbitrary metrics such as journal impact factor?
That's a question that's come up again and again, and I think it's a valid concern that many people have, and I'm going to give you my best attempt to answer it. Another way, maybe less politely, to talk about that is the concept of elitism. And it seems to me that there are two ways to think about elitism. There is the hereditary elitism with a silver spoon in the mouth, where with no relationship to someone's qualities, merit, capacities, they automatically get something. And I won't say which particular nation to be in that category, but we all know about that. The alternative is that there are a group of people who are identified by their accomplishments as being elite because they merit what they have years. And so my own view is that I'm interested in meritocracy will always at some level lead to a group of people being identified as outperforming some other people, whether that's true in athletics, can they get to the tape faster, or in science, do they produce more impactful work that really changes the field? And so the question is, can the retrospective review process that I say is at the core of this whole change for the person that is looking at what they do be made rigorous enough and unbiased enough for people to get their due based on what they really accomplish? And the point I make about this is if we look at every level in academia for how we move people along from high school to university, how people are selected for graduate school, how people are selected as fellows, and how people are hired as faculty, we always rely on their past record and some letters from people who know them well enough that hopefully they are providing insightful information. And then sometimes, a personal interview or a chalk talk to really see that the person is what the paperwork appears to suggest. The only place we don't really do that, or we really imbalance it, is in the grant system. Because now what you write on that particular piece of paper is taken as much more important than all these other factors that we think in academia have always been pretty reliable, within the limits of human reliability, the right ways to do an evaluation. And so here, all I'm saying is we're going to apply that also to the funding. And if people are really good as scientists, yes, they will do well in the system. But it doesn't mean that people are being given special privilege, which I think is the question that's been raised here, in an inappropriate manner. We do have to figure out, if you have a CNS journal publication, is that really better than, for example, if you're a virologist being in Journal of Virology? Many virologists would say no, not necessarily, and some of the very best work is done there. If those are people reviewing people retrospectively, they know what the work is, and even people in the field can write letters, and that's part of the way I've sort of set this up, as if you were going through a faculty promotion. I think we've tried to make this as merit-based as possible.
Okay, the next question I think follows up on that very nicely. I think your previous answer probably focused more on how you're evaluated for your first grant. The related question from the audience here, which came in by email or tweet, is after the initial period, how do you envision evaluating the scientists? And how can we avoid evaluating contributions to the field by the number of journal articles published in top journals? What other factors should be important? And maybe I'll throw in another sub-question there, is whether some of that evaluation at the next round, after you've had your 5 years, whether the numbers add up, whether there can be a personal presentation, to a committee involved in that decision, as is done with Howard Hughes. But anyway, you can see the spectrum of questions now gets into what is the best mechanism of evaluating your first 5 to 7 years to see if you're going to be continue in the system.
I'll slightly repeat myself, which is it's very similar in my view to how you get promoted on a faculty. People are going to look at what you published. They're going to look at whether you had an impact on the field, in part by whether people know who you are by inviting you to talk about your work at scientific conferences or at universities. And they're going to rely, as I said, I would include this, at least letters from people in the field that say, yes, this work has had an impact. It's changed the way we thought about this, or it's answered an outstanding question. Whether there can be the time and flexibility at the scale we're talking about to have an interview in front of a committee, I think that might be difficult to arrange, even with Skype and other electronic means of doing presentations. It might be restricted for where things are on the margin, and that would make a big difference in hearing directly from an individual to give confidence that they really are in command of the work or have a sense of where it might go if there was some concern. But I think the others are more or less our academic standards for trying to do evaluation. Convincing people not to give more credit to publications in certain journals is not something that I can directly address here. It's something for all of us to deal with, and you've written about that recently as well. In addition, although I've said that what you write exactly in your grant for your aims and your preliminary data is the most important, people do look at what you publish once you're moving along in your career, and they're just as subject to thinking about which journal you've been publishing in as any other. So none of these systems completely get out of paying attention to where you've published at a certain level. But I think that by having people in the field say, what has the science really contributed, what is their perception of the impact, helps to level that away from just looking at the named journals by people who don't know what's really happening in the field, and concentrated in terms of whether your colleagues recognize the work you've been doing. And I think that's as close as we can get. And there's still going to be human failings in that, and prejudices and biases. I don't know how to completely weed them out of the system.
Also, I will say that Gary or other people that ask questions on evaluation, if you have a specific proposal that you would like discussed here, feel free to add that to a Google comment or a tweet. But I will pull up the next question that has the next most votes, and well, it's, I think, related to this question. It's obviously something that we're really struggling with in our current system, and no doubt a lot of thought has to be put into this particular question, which is building and maintaining a diverse scientific workforce. And the specific question here is how that relates to your proposal. How can you assure that we build and maintain a diverse scientific workforce under this new granting mechanism for young scientists that you're proposing?
So I think there are a couple of different strategies that can be used. First of all, I became aware recently of just how influential some individuals can be in promoting diversity by training people who then rise to positions of recognition themselves, and then that reinforces the whole field. To the extent that those individuals occupy places in university environments in which they now control this funding locally, they actually have more power than the current and essentially anonymous system to help influence bringing people in, giving them a shot at having this sort of opportunity to move forward. So I actually think by having this institutional aspect here, you have more power to do that than exists in the sort of very anonymized study section systems that we have right now. Beyond that, I think that I mentioned in the commentary that it is not completely a one-size-fits-all here. While I've suggested how one might distribute some of the funding at the outset of starting this kind of regime, I think that there has to be attention paid to the fact that there are going to be individuals whose opportunities for higher education are limited to certain institutions that might not be the usual powerhouse places that will have the largest proportion of these funds. And I think there is a real societal benefit in having individuals at those institutions that can be role models as research scientists that can enthuse a young person coming through universities to want to try to do science, and then move into the larger, more diverse system that we typically think about. So I think both of those features are ways to try to do this. They're much larger issues in society in general that go into early schooling and training that all contribute to this, that are beyond the scope of what I can deal with in this particular proposal.
Well, even just as a quick follow-up on that, part of your proposal is that the grants are given to institutions in terms of distribution, which is obviously very different than the way the system works right now. That is an opportunity also to look at issues like geographic diversity and other factors like that, but it's a complicated issue. I just wanted to get your thoughts, I mean, related to issues of diversity, geography, as well as excellence of institutions. How would you imagine, that distribution working out?
Well, my proposal for how to get this started relies on the status quo. What is the general distribution of research funding for junior faculty at institutions? Because that way we're neither adding nor taking away anybody's resource at the outset. We're not trying to enrich a particular institution or deprive another institution of their resources. And then going forward, the notion is that you really are going to rate each institution on the success of their hires going into the retrospective review system that I propose for the next level up from your initial faculty position. So institutions that don't hire well, don't support their junior faculty, are going to do poorly in that type of system. They would not compete well in the next round for maintaining either all or a portion of their institutional funds, and they could be moved to other institutions that are, shall we say, quicker on their feet or have put more emphasis on doing this well, so that we're always putting the money in the institution that seems to be the best at encouraging their new hires to do very good science. And so that, first of all, doesn't lock this money into the institutions. People have worried that administrators are very good at moving money around and will defeat the purposes of these institutional grants. But my argument against that is if they don't really support their new hires and junior faculty and they don't do well in this retrospective review system, they'll lose that funding. And I think even the very top institutions, if they lose that funding, would be hard-pressed to recruit the very best of the next generation, because they'll go where that support exists. And unless they're dipping deeply into their endowments, they wouldn't be able to support those types of positions. So I think this really puts the emphasis on not treating junior faculty as some type of fodder to bring in indirect costs or do anything else and let's just see what happens. But here's a real investment that the institution is making to the success of those individuals, and I think that's very important.
I guess the one question, I'll have one more follow-up question, and we'll get to some more audience questions. But if at the onset the distribution of these junior scientist grants are driven by the status quo, it may be reflecting the current level of funding at different institutions. But I guess the question is whether that will cement things in people's opinions of which institution is a better or more successful institution than another, and whether that will kind of also drive young scientist choices in terms of where they would want to go. So, and also, for example, if you're a small place like Amherst, maybe you get X number of positions, which are going to be very small. But whether, if that's going to be an impediment for an institution for hiring, kind of beyond the positions that they are allotted with the first call of applications for junior faculty.
The point is well taken. But I would also turn it around to say that institutions with limited funding now have limited research enterprises ongoing, and they are only attracted to a certain subset of people who wish to be at that type of institution. So I'm not sure it really imbalances those forces as they currently exist. You could question whether the distribution of funding is based solely on real performance, scientific output, and value for the dollars invested in the current institutions, and seek to rebalance things other than in the way I've proposed. The problem is you're then back to the question you asked previously, what's the right metric? Are you going to go and look at impact scores of the aggregate publications from the institution? You know, how do you decide that the dollars that anybody would get based on this kind of historical analysis are inappropriate and move them around? So other than for the societal purposes we talked about, whether for diversity or some geographic distribution where there can be some attention paid, in the end of the day, science has sort of voted in a certain way, and people have sort of voted both also where they'd like to live and by many other criteria for where they want to do their science. And I don't know that other than around these kinds of margins we've talked about, there's any better way to do the distribution. And as I say, performance will become the metric going forward. And yes, it may enable successful places to continue to be successful or be more successful, but unless you want to just mandate that it has to be distributed more widely, independent of all of the societal desires of where to live, lifestyle, accumulation of colleagues in a focused area, and so forth, I'm not sure I have any better suggestions for how to do it.
Well, this may lead in to this next question, which is really how to do anything, how to change the system and move it, in any perceptible way from it, the current status quo. So this is another question that was tweeted or emailed into us. And that is, what do you see as the biggest barriers, NIH bureaucracy, institution, to implementing a major change in the grant system, such as your proposal?
Well, NIH and the administration here actually has already begun to do at least small pilot trials of this, though not exactly in the way that I'm proposing. So most of what's been done in the NCI and NIGMS has been initially to support more senior individuals with what used to be called merit awards, and I don't know what the current name is, but giving people longer periods of time without having to do constant renewals and rolling grants into one. The problem is, as I said, they're mostly directed to more senior individuals. NIGMS now does have a sort of junior equivalent, but it's not truly equivalent. It's really rather small and isn't full funding of the type that I'm talking about. But clearly, NIH has seen that the regular grant system is not really meeting the needs or the requirements of the community, and is experimenting with some of these ideas. My own view is it's going to take 1 or 2 generations at the rate that they're doing these experiments necessarily to collect enough data to possibly change things, and that's a little bit slow from my own perspective. So what else could be done? Well, most people listening to this probably know that Shirley Tillman and Mark Kirshner and Bruce Alberts and Harold Varmus wrote a piece, I don't know, must be almost 2 years ago now, in PNAS, raising these issues. They held a follow-up meeting. They've created a site to try to keep promoting dealing with the biomedical enterprise and what they see as a crisis in it. But again, it's unclear exactly, even with all that firepower behind it, where that's going to go. There were, interestingly, a number of people that I communicated my pre-commentary to who had positions in learned societies and felt that they could play a major role in moving this discussion forward. Unfortunately, it appears that most of the societies, and I don't want to tar and feather any particular one, have decided that for the sake of their members, their main lobbying efforts have to be only for more money from NIH and not for necessarily changing the system. And that takes a big leg away from the impetus to actually accomplish this change. And I think the society members need to think about whether only pushing their society to push for more funding. I don't mean the restoration of the eroded funding, which even in the commentary I point out is really essential. But, excuse me, whether they should be also pushing for changes in the system along with any of the funding changes, because I think those obviously are impactful organizations. The other thing is that scientists need to be more active on their own. There had been discussion, one of your colleagues, Rich Loxley, had mentioned the possibility of an Asilomar-like meeting, similar to the one on DNA, recombinant DNA, where some type of manifesto of what scientists really would like to happen in the U.S. funding system comes forward to let people know that this is actually what they want. When I say this, I don't necessarily mean what I propose, but that a change, maybe along these lines, maybe different, is really important, and they hope progress will be made. And the last piece of this that I've only learned about more recently are the administrators in the universities. It's not clear that they have the same views of things, if I want to be polite about it, as the scientists. And there are some real issues that have to be resolved between administrators and investigators about whether it really costs the university more every time somebody gets a grant, even with the indirect costs, in order to support that additional funding coming into the institution, and so forth. And I think there have to be some smaller groups of representatives from each of those parties getting together and coming to some kind of common cause of how that can be dealt with going forward, because I think that's actually another source of real inhibition of changing the system in this direction.
Okay, great. I am going to kind of combine two questions that I see here. They both have to deal with, again, the issue of evaluating both individuals and institutions. So I'm going to combine these two questions and explain that a little bit. So just picking one, oh, this was not the right one. Okay, the right one did not get put up there for some reason. But anyway, here are the questions. So one was, shouldn't factors like mentoring, teaching ability, contribution to scientific community be factored into the evaluation of scientists? And from Twitter, Needy Bala also asks, can racial and gender diversity be factored into the characterization of institutional success? So, I'll combine both of those questions, both in how you decide on funding an individual or actually granting an institution with an allotment of junior faculty funding grants. Is it worthwhile not just to consider the science output, but also look at other factors? How good is this institution in terms of, promoting diversity within their institution, promoting mentoring? At the individual level, can one look at similar types of, community building characteristics as well?
So let me start with the institution first. There are clearly legal issues there having to do with how do you do that evaluation without it becoming a quota. And so I can't address the legalities of doing this, but within the constraints that exist in setting goals, if you want to call them goals, or at least evaluating whether documenting that efforts are being made, that there are results from those efforts to maintain diversity, to have good mentoring. I don't see why those can't be included along with the scientific output I've mentioned as factors for whether an institution is really the optimal place for major investments. So I think it's a matter of dividing, what is legally allowed in terms of evaluating those parameters versus what you can build in to accomplish what you just stated. On the individual level, I think that's included. Those are many of the factors that are brought into bear on tenure reviews. They don't, in a research institution, necessarily outweigh the science that people are providing, but they count toward the overall package. And especially here in the system in which I said letters and community input on what the standing is and the contributions are, people would comment that someone has actually trained terrific people who have gone out into the system and made additional contributions, and that therefore their lab is really contributing to the science, if only somewhat in an indirect way through the progeny of that laboratory and their science. So that is a factor, not an overwhelming factor, but one that clearly counts and should be considered. And so I think on the individual level, it's easier to see how those things can be included in the scheme that I'm talking about. I think it's a little trickier on the institutional level in terms of what the metrics should be and how you measure it, but I don't think there's a reason to completely exclude them.
Also, to paraphrase what you said, is I think you're saying that should be brought into more of the evaluation, especially for renewal of a grant, than is currently done.
Right. Well, right now the grants really hinge on just what you write on the paper, a little bit about your environment and a very little bit about track record beyond a certain ephemeral thinking about that. And so yes, that can surely be part of the metric here. And especially in a schema, by the way, in which I've talked about the labs changing their balance between the research associate or staff scientist component and a smaller number of more trainees, of students or maybe fellows that should get better mentoring. There should be more time available to mentor those individuals, and that actually should increase the value of that in the overall system and the evaluation of whether that's really happening.
Okay, I'm going to now pick up a question by Jessica Polka. I clicked on that earlier, and it's up there. But this is also a very interesting question relevant to your proposal. The broader question is, what is the optimal lab size? Should this be set on an individual level, just by efficiency of output, i.e. papers per dollar, or is there a way to engineer the workforce structure? If that's okay, Jessica, I might also add to your question that I believe in Ron's proposal, the funding would be for smaller group sizes of yourself and maybe 3 to 5 people. And, well, I mean, one thing that I notice amongst junior faculty is that they feel a pressure to build up their lab to a large size very quickly. That's currently seen as kind of a, maybe I think not a good metric of success, but by many it is seen as a metric of success. As you said, they quickly leave the lab, don't do experiments anymore. So your proposal is very different in the sense that this would be like nurturing an environment where you're expected to have a small lab for the first part of your junior investigator period. So relevant to Jessica's question, how does your proposal really, I think, affect the culture of science and also engineering the workforce structure, as Jessica alluded to in her question?
Okay, so the numbers I gave were approximation, but it turns out NIGMS has done a study that at least if you want to quantify things in terms of optimization of numbers for output per dollar in the way you've mentioned it, 6 is the number they come up with. It's the same number that Genelia Farms basically used when they set themselves up. So every time people have tried to look at that type of number based on historical data, the number comes out somewhere in the range of 6. And so I had proposed a person plus 3 to 5 people, which means a 4 to 6 person lab. So for a junior lab, very much in the framework that other people have said is pretty optimal for getting things done. And from my own experience and those of my colleagues, a number where everybody can be effectively mentored, interacted with, followed on a very regular basis. Once you begin to get up to much larger numbers, something has to give. There's just not enough time to interact with everybody, put all the same effort into what everybody does. And so labs that get much bigger begin to get stratified, and as far as I can tell. There are a few people who are really the stars of the lab. They're paid the most attention to, they're given the most resources. Other people do what they're doing. They either are somewhat productive or they become part of the teams of these, the star fellows or whatever, to get their primary work out. So it's a very sort of different structure. And in terms of the PI, mentee interaction, if you're not in that first tier, you're definitely going to suffer relative to the other people. But there are also occasions and reasons why for diversity of skill sets, larger laboratories can be very productive and valuable within certain size constraints. So I don't have a hard number, and I didn't propose that labs never grow. Actually, once you're out of the first phase, there's clearly a proposal for some people to justify growing beyond this initial scale. How big that should be allowed to be, how much resources are things that other people have debated, and I don't have a fixed answer to. But I think the culture should be definitely not of disposable members of laboratories, just bring them in and see what happens, any more than I thought they're disposable faculty members. I think people should be thoughtful about this, really make the investment and do the very best they can to make sure people are provided with the training that's appropriate and that they need, where there really is careful monitoring of the science. And one of the things that my fellows already comment on, they never understand how hard it is to go from being the person generating the data to being the person looking at somebody else's data and really being sure of what they're looking at and really having the quality control. And when there are very large numbers of such people, it becomes an even bigger challenge. And so for the sake of reliability and reproducibility in science, I think there's an issue here about not exceeding one's ability to really monitor things. And so I think, and that lastly, it's just a financial issue. If we have these very large labs and people are staying for the number of years they're staying now, we're just going to keep overpopulating the field relative to the dollars. So somewhere that has to be titrated. The smaller, so let me finish with the smaller size in the beginning is also because people are just learning how to mentor others and monitor their work. But it's also because, if we go back to an earlier conversation, we're never going to be able to be 100% effective at picking exactly the right people. There are only going to be so many dollars available for these new hires. If you make the average size larger, then you have even fewer of them, and that means you're going to have an even more selective process. And I think we need a little bit of room to see who's actually going to make it in the system. And so there's just not the resourcing to make them much larger.
Okay, I think looking at the hour, we'll close with this last question, and maybe we could get a kind of short 2 or 3 minute response. But I think this is a good question to end a very interesting discussion that we've had with you, Ron. Your proposal has generated a lot of conversation, some critical and some negative. These types of responses might dissuade people from coming forward with their own ideas. What advice would you give others with ideas for major change?
So I have to start by saying that I don't follow many or any of the blogs that are out there on some of these topics, and I don't tweet. But I was made aware by various mechanisms of some of the comments that were out there. Most of the ones that were in anonymous blogs and in some tweets were fairly negative. A lot of the things I received directly by email were pretty positive, and then a few were negative. And in 1 or 2 of those cases, I had the opportunity to directly engage with people who had significant criticisms of the proposal, and provide them with my best view of why I thought what I had stated would not cause the problems they mentioned and so forth. So that engagement turned out to be pretty effective. And judging by what happened in the blogosphere and so forth after those types of responses, when there was direct engagement on a professional level, in a sense, no one was flaming at somebody else, you weren't criticizing them personally. It was, I don't know that there's merit in this, or you're going to overpopulate the labs, you're going to foster only some of the universities in the way we've discussed it here. And you could go through the arguments pro and con. I think people began to understand what's going on. I don't have a magic way of dealing with the other types of things that float around in the ether when people make these proposals. And I guess if folks were worried that they could be adversely affected in their careers by those responses, it's an issue they have to think about. I guess my view was that was very unlikely to happen, and that I'm grown up enough to deal with comments that may be out of sort, but don't really affect the serious debate about an important issue. So I encourage people to bring their ideas out. I truly encourage people to engage with me in a debate about these various factors. And as I pointed out in the piece, I spent a long time discussing this, looking for criticisms and modifying my thoughts along the way. I don't think that this is the definitive answer, but it's a way that I think could be better than what we have, and is truly the basis for good discussion.
Well, on that note, Ron, I want to thank you for your time and for a fantastic 1-hour discussion. And I also want to thank you personally, as well as on behalf, I think, of our viewers, of really thinking about this issue and really tackling it. I think the easiest thing to do is just put one's head in the sand and just ignore it. But you have a very good condition at the NIH, and what you're doing is really not thinking about your own situation, but thinking about others, and trying to make also a good environment for all the young scientists who are coming up to have the same opportunities that you and I did in the system. So we really do thank you for that. And with that, I'll just tell our audience that we, first of all, have a talk by John Lorsch that is just posted on iBiology, where he discusses lab size and productivity. We also encourage you to look at other videos that iBiology is producing on the workforce. We're going to have a series of additional videos on these kinds of topics over the next several months, and we'll also have additional Google Hangouts. So I would encourage you just to follow this. It's a very important issue. It's something that should involve all the community, senior scientists and junior scientists. And anyway, what we're trying to do in iBiology is just to encourage this conversation. And also out of this conversation, the intention is that actions will happen. And with that, I thank everyone and look forward to further discussions.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Rob. Bye-bye.